1 John chapter 4. I want to begin reading in verse 16. John says, "And so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world we are like Jesus. There's no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because He first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates his brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And He has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister." Our third week in a series of sermons that I've simply been referring to as God's DNA. The idea came about because in today's culture we have any number of crime shows and detective shows on television that talk about DNA. There's this fascination with DNA. There's this fascination about how DNA defines the genetic uniqueness of who we are. In fact, there are companies that in their commercials and in their advertisements will advertise, they seek to communicate their message where they've tried to say that the essential nature of who that company is in their DNA. Now, while we have spent the last couple of weeks and are going to spend yet a third week talking about God's DNA, I do hope you know that God doesn't really have DNA, okay? I just want to make sure I don't want you to be in a conversation with, well, our pastor says God's DNA, and they're going to look at you like, what? But what we do know is that there are essential characteristics of God. There are those things so basic to who God is, how God acts within us, and how God is in the universe that we would describe those things as the essential characteristics that, as an analogy, are a part of God's DNA. In other words, they are characteristics that make God, God. Now, if we take that idea a little further about the essential uniqueness that's passed on from one generation to another via DNA, we can consider how the essential characteristics of God are stamped upon God's children. How does the image of God reside within us? I mean, what does it mean when in the creation story, God said, "Let us make man in our image, male and female"? What does it mean to say we're created in the image of God? My guess is we've all had that experience at one time or another where we've seen a little girl and we say to her parents, "Boy, she has her mother's eyes." You know. Or we might say to a little boy, we might say to his parents, "Boy, does he have your father's temperament." You know. We see how those things have been passed on. We can recognize them in the children of our friends. The question is, what characteristics should a person see when they look at the children of God? Now, over the last 2 weeks, we've looked at the characteristics of humility and justice. Today, I want us to consider, for lack of a better word, charity. Now, what exactly do we tend to think of when we think of the word charity? Uh, Not such good things sometimes. And what I mean by that is most of the times when we hear the word charity, we think of, well, they're just a charity case. Okay? I remember as a young boy, my dad used to love to watch Westerns. I grew up watching Westerns, Bonanza, Gunsmoke, all of those types of things. And occasionally, when we were watching one of the shows, there would be some pioneer family who had fallen on hard times. They were down on their luck. And when they were approached by the townspeople who were trying to simply help them, these individuals would often say to the townsfolk trying to help, "We don't take no charity." Okay? In other words, charity was, and perhaps still is, viewed as sort of pity wrapped up with a bow. Okay? Now, most of us have probably heard 1 Corinthians 13 at some time as it's read from the King James Version of the Bible. The King James Version, Mike, this is for you. Okay? Just in the event you all do not know, Mike Coffey, his Bible is the King James Version. And he will call me on occasion to say, "I don't know what this means." I've tried to say, "Mike, if you get the New International Version, it would help excel a whole lot." But I don't want us to even go down that rabbit hole this morning, okay? But in 1 Corinthians 13, if you read it from the King James Version, it says this: "Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity." Okay? And throughout the entire 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, the translators of the King James Version have used the word charity to try and wrap two things together. Two things that when we think about God simply cannot be separated. Okay? Those two things, wrapped up in the word charity, those two things that are a part of God and who He is, are love and giving. Love and giving. The text that we just read from 1 John contains that essential message that what? God is love. And if we follow through this passage, one of the things that John is saying to the early church is that this love is to be evident in the children of God. This is how we know that we are God's children, in the fact that God first loved us. And so we are to love as well. But if we want to add other passages, we begin to get the idea of how love and giving are woven together into one experience. And perhaps no passage provides better evidence for that than perhaps one of the Bible's most well-known verses. God so loved the world that what? He gave His one and only Son. Okay? The DNA of God is this giving love. And you simply cannot have one without the other. And in trying to think about the basic essence of God's character that is in us, there is no way for me to think about my deepest convictions about God without saying things that I have already said before. Now, for a lot of churches, for all churches, this is the fall of the year. Okay? And every year in most churches, as we enter into fall, it's a time when the church begins to think and talk about what we call stewardship in terms of giving to the church. And unfortunately, instead of hearing a message about what God's love is in us, we tend to think only in terms of giving to the church. Well, I hope you noticed thus far that we've not mentioned anything about sacrificial giving to the church. Neither am we going to talk about this morning any need to write a check to the church. Not in today's message. Because today's message is about the character of God. But you see, the truth is, you can give without loving. Think about that for a moment. You can give without loving. In fact, our culture has come pretty close to perhaps ruining two of the best holidays for giving: Christmas and Valentine's Day. Because you see, the fact that you can give without loving, Christmas has simply become a list of persons that you have to check off your list because you feel obligated to buy for them. Now, it's a list that includes people at work, neighbors, teachers, so on and so forth. It's not so much an act of love anymore. It has simply become an act of obligation. We have this list of names that we need to buy for. The same could also be said of Valentine's Day. Instead of being an act of trying to uniquely express your love to someone you care about, quite honestly, it's become an opportunity to fail miserably by not living up to the other person's expectations. Just for example. But, hey, make the purchase, check the name off the list, because it's a holiday where we are supposed to give. In that regard, society has just about ruined the great joy of simply giving. Why? Because you can give without loving. On the other hand, you cannot love without giving. If you think about the person or the people that you care the most about, the people that you love the most, the people that you love above all other people, let me ask you a question. Have any of those people never received a gift from you? Of course not. My guess is each and every one of them have received a gift from you at one time or another. Because the fact is, you cannot love without giving. Even in the most depressed financial situations, even in the most impoverished places in the world, people who love each other find a way to give things to each other. Granted, it may be small, it may simply be a trinket, it may be something you don't really consider much of a gift, but it's something people have to give to another individual. Why? Simply because of their love for that person. I'll give you an example. There is a story about a journalist in Central America during the 1980s it's a story that was written about the great poverty being experienced by the people in this particular Central American country. People who were being, displaced because of civil war. And this particular journalist tells the story in which, out of nowhere, a little girl who was hiding in the compound where the journalists were staying suddenly ran out from under hiding because someone who was a journalist had thrown a banana peel out onto the ground. And this little girl suddenly runs out, scoops up the banana peel, and ran back under a bush in which she was hiding. It was observed by this journalist and others that a little boy, presumably her brother, was sitting under the same bush where she took the banana peel. And once underneath that bush, she tore that banana peel into two. Okay? There was 1/3, and there were 2/3. She kept the 1/3 of the banana peel and gave the 2/3 of the banana peel to her brother. And you're saying, well, that's not much to eat. You're absolutely correct. But even in that act, she was giving a gift. Why? Because not only did she love her brother, but she cared about her brother. This is where the story of the widow's mite comes from. It's not about giving out of abundance, but rather it's about giving out of poverty. Listen, even in the most desperate of circumstances, when people love one another, when people love God, they give. It's not an obligation. It's not seen as an obligation, not viewed as an obligation. Rather, it's an expression of love. It's part of the image that God has stamped on us. God so loved the world that He gave. God's love is demonstrated in us in that there is a desire within us for us to give. It's there. Now, granted, it sometimes doesn't express itself as we would hope, but the truth is, it's in God's DNA. And it has been given and imparted and stamped upon each and every one of us. Hear me. Some of the things of God that give us the most blessing, some of the things that touch our hearts most deeply, are God's mercy, God's forgiveness, and God's grace. Simply put, aren't those expressions of God giving Himself to us? Christmas time is just several weeks away. And during the Advent season, when we talk about presents, we say that the greatest present, the greatest gift ever given, is Jesus Christ. God coming into the world in the flesh, giving Himself. Listen, all of this is wrapped up in the word charity. The fact that giving and love go together. And so what's the lesson? What is it other than to think that God expresses Himself in that old-fashioned word called charity? Love and giving. A giving love. However, there are a couple of things to think about. One, when we think about being closer to God and the hunger that we have for that closeness, what can we do in order that we might somehow feel closer to God? Here's the thing. You and I will never be closer to God than when we give. Mark that down. You and I will never, ever be closer to God than when we give. When we give on certain occasions, that's the one reason why we feel so blessed. How many of you, when you have given, do not at least feel blessed in your giving? And the reason we feel so blessed when we give is because it's a reflection of God's own love being poured through us. And when God's love is poured through us, how can we not experience it as a blessing? Now, if we give simply to be blessed, well, that rarely works. Why? Because it's not a gift given out of love. You follow? But when love expresses itself in giving and we wonder why that feels good, it's because it's a reflection of God's love being poured through us. The second thing I would say is this. What we really want from God is simply God. If God were to express himself in us, it results in giving. I mean, just think about all the things that we pray for and ask for from God. Well, what we really want is God's help. Isn't that really what we're looking for? God's help? I mean, we hear sermons and Bible studies about things we asked for and didn't get. So here's my question. How many of us ever prayed, God, make me more giving, and didn't get what we asked for from God? And in that, felt closer to God. The truth of the matter is, this idea of giving and love, or love and giving, makes all the difference in the world in how we interpret Scripture. Because there's something to be said for an old-fashioned word, charity. You see, charity is understood in the King James as what it truly means to love and give of ourselves. Now, it's probably been a while since you have either read or heard it read. So I want to close with this. I want to close by simply reading again 1 Corinthians 13 out of the King James Version, in which Paul says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could move mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity, he says, never fails. So let's skip to the end of the chapter and also substitute the word giving. And now faith, hope, and giving abideth, these three. But the greatest of these is giving. I will simply repeat that we are never more Christ-like. We are never more like the one who made us than when our hearts truly and genuinely give out of love. So my prayer is this. May God give all of us generous hearts so that in the world, people will simply look at us and say, I see God in them. I see God